And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Clint Watts, an FPRI Senior Fellow with the Program on National Security. Clint Watts is the president of Miburu Solutions Incorporated. His research focuses on analyzing transnational threat groups operating in local environments on a global scale. Before starting Miburu Solutions, he served as a U.S. Army infantry officer, an FBI special agent on a joint terrorism task force, and as the executive officer of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. Clint's publications include Al-Qaeda's Misadventures in the Horn of Africa, Combating Terrorism Center, 2007. He was co-editor and co-author. He also has numerous articles in the Small Wars Journal, and that includes Can the Anbar Strategy Work in Pakistan? Also, Beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, What Foreign Fighter Data Reveals About the Future of Terrorism, and Foreign Fighters, How Are They Being Recruited? He also has an article entitled Counterterrorism from the Second Foreign Fighter Glut. Capturing the Potential of Outlier Ideas in the Intelligence Community was published in Studies in Intelligence by the CIA. He is also the editor of the SelectedWisdom.com blog. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Clint Watts.
All right, good morning. Can you guys hear me? I can shout. I'm good. Oh, there it is. Okay. So just to start off this morning, I wanted to do a few caveats. One, I'm going to talk a lot about Al-Qaeda's history. I am not a regional expert or a country expert on any one thing. All the speakers you've had up to this point, they know all that stuff way better than me. I listen to what they say. So I'll give you a little bit of a compilation, and I come from a little bit different background. So on 9/11, I was an infantry company commander at Fort Lewis, Washington. I was at a ambush live fire range when we found out about the attacks, and it was kind of the first time we knew we were going to be doing this for real someday, and the world sort of changed on us. And I had been one of those guys that filled out the "Do you want to be an FBI agent" card and dropped it in the mail in August 2001. So I had thrown in the thing because I was like, 2 or 3 years from now, I might want to be an FBI agent. It was October 1st. I got a call. I was like, hey, can you take the test? And boom, I was a 9/11 hire. I moved from the Army in 2002 to the FBI and was on a joint terrorism task force and ended up going to grad school and then serving in a place called the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. And in 2006, went back and I worked for the FBI for on and off for about 6 years now. I've worked for them. And Special Operations Command in Tampa. So I've kind of been in military and law enforcement fields, splitting my time between the two. And an ironic story, Mike Duran last night talked to you about the Sunni Shia, like the leadership of the FBI not knowing about it. Well, what he doesn't know is it was actually one of his former students, a guy named Will McCants, that was the solution for that problem. So one of my jobs when I was working for the FBI was I got a call like on a Thursday and was like, hey, we need to teach everybody about this Sunni Shia thing, like fast. I was like, okay. So I was at West Point. I was working on that program, and part of our job was to begin training. We had just gotten started at this point, and one of his students, Will McCants, was working with me, and we made flashcards that you could put in your wallet. One side was Sunni, one side was Shia, and we would go, and every time we did a course, we'd hand it out and be like, okay, Sunni, what happens? And they check it out, and they go, a Sunni is, and then boom. All right, flip it over, Shia. What is Shia? All right, Shia is, boom. But that's what I've been doing. I've been working a lot in training and consulting, trying to figure out ways to essentially communicate really complex factors about Al-Qaeda to diverse audience. And mostly I work with implementers. So I work with academics, but I'm training or consulting or pairing with implementers. And with them, we have to boil down thousands of years of history all into small packages. Because if you're an FBI agent or you're in the military, one day you might be fighting Al-Qaeda, the next day it could be Hezbollah, the next day you might be dealing with cyber threats. And so how do you learn or gain mastery in all those materials real quick? So today, what I'm going to talk to you about is sort of where things are going. In your titles there on this presentation is called Al-Qaeda 2.0. Thanks to Microsoft, we can now mentally frame everything in 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. But as I was putting this presentation together, I realized that we're really in this bridge period between Generation 2 and Generation 3 with Al-Qaeda, and it's pretty significant what's going on right now. So what I want to do is give you some quick history and background, and then kind of jump into where we're at in modern day. And then I'll leave a lot of room at the end for questions. I'm going to show you a couple snapshots of things that I work on during my day job when I'm doing this stuff. So let's do a quick rehash of Al-Qaeda 1.0. Anybody that's been up at 2 in the morning already knows this because it's on the National Geographic Channel. If it's not a Hitler special, it's like the history of Al-Qaeda, right? So this is the basic briefing, but let's do a quick rehash of some key points because I think a lot of it gets lost in the scary music. The first thing is, how did this really get started? There was a first, what I call a foreign fighter migration that occurred in the 1980s. Foreign fighters, Muslims from all over the world, traveled to Afghanistan, and there was a guy named Abdullah Azzam, right here. You can't really see my red dot, but he's the guy on the far left. He was inspiring. He would put out propaganda, actually on tapes, pieces of paper, gets distributed all over the world to religious centers, mosques, magazines, whatever. People would pick up these things, they would read it, they would get inspired by the cause, they would travel to Pakistan, and in Pakistan they would go to a key location known as Peshawar. Peshawar was essentially what we call the reception, staging, onward movement, and integration point, RSO&I for military folks, for distributing foreign fighters onto the battlefield in Afghanistan. There is where you see these foreign fighters link up, 2 of which were guys named Bin Laden and Zawahiri, who later go on to essentially form Al-Qaeda. At the end of the Afghan campaign, when the Soviets have left, you have all these fighters there. They've been together for quite some time. And Bin Laden's idea is essentially, we're going to set up what's known as a Services Bureau, the base, Al-Qaeda, in Peshawar, where we train, integrate, and we create a vanguard movement that will then go on to lead our crusade around the world. That's the genesis of this concept. So that's around August 1988. They essentially are thinking this, and they're building the basis for what would become Al-Qaeda. Anybody remember what happens in 1991? 1991, Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm. When this happens, the U.S. goes to the Middle East, and this really, really ramps up Al-Qaeda. The base gets enraged. And Bin Laden and a lot of these guys are not welcome back in their homelands. So it was great sending foreign fighters to the battlefields. This is going to come back. We're going to talk about it in modern context. Great sending foreign fighters to the battlefields in Afghanistan. Not so great getting them back. Saudi Arabia is one of those countries that's nervous. And Bin Laden actually offers his vanguard, Al-Qaeda, to fight against the Iraqis, essentially. And he's turned down. Instead, go with the United States. Bin Laden is enraged by this because you have American forces, Westerners, occupying holy lands that are going to fight on behalf of Muslims because Al-Qaeda is not allowed. This enrages. And this sort of sets the stage for this build-up, this anger and frustration. What you see is a transition in 1992. Bin Laden essentially moves. Oh, you can't see it. You'll see Sudan. I tried to put years in there. Those are rough years. 92, he moves to Sudan. He builds up outside Khartoum. He actually has illicit businesses. He's got like a tannery, some other things going on, and they're trying to do agriculture. They got construction companies, things like that they're trying to build up. But he builds up a cadre of Al-Qaeda members in Khartoum. They begin planning, and their idea is we're going to work with other movements, just like we did in Afghanistan, to fight against the West now. The first place they really try and do this is in Somalia between 1992 and 94. This is kind of not well known or not talked about a lot. In 92 and 94, they use a model a lot like a U.S. Special Forces unit, where they send out teams of about 4 to 6 operatives. They go into southern Somalia, and they try and link up with local clans to get them to fight against UN forces. This is the Black Hawk Down era. They get to Somalia, and it doesn't go real well. And you can actually read their documents at the Combating Terrorism Center. They're all hosted there. We entitled our study Al-Qaeda's Misadventures in the Horn of Africa. You see all sorts of funny, comedic stories. Just like anybody that doesn't know Somalia and just jumps into southern Somalia, it's quite a reckless place. And they will join up with clans. The clans will be like, yeah, we'll train with you. And they'll be like, okay, let's go attack the UN. And the clans will say, no, first I've got to attack this other clan down the street because they stole our truck. And there's a little diversion there. And then they'll be like, well, we want to continue the attack, but we could really use some money and some shoes and some canteens. And there's all sorts of requirements. So Al-Qaeda gets bled out here in southern Somalia. It doesn't go well. And that really shapes their thinking. In Sudan, they start to say, you know what, if we're going to do this, we really have to do direct attacks. We have to start our own thing. We're not going to integrate. Remember this, we're going to come back to it. We're not going to integrate with all of these clans and this clanism, this tribal factions. We're going to do our own attacks. 1992, you also see their first attack in Yemen. This is really their first bombing. They tried to do a bombing in Yemen. It doesn't go real well. It sort of misses the target, but they actually execute an attack. This is all occurring at the same time. By 94, they're fed up in Somalia. Everybody's gone back to Khartoum. And now they're starting to plot, okay, what are we going to do for the future? There are two things that happen. There are two fatwas issued. The first one comes in 96. Bin Laden issues a fatwa, essentially declares war on the United States. It doesn't really resonate that much. It doesn't get a lot of play. But he issues a second fatwa in 1998, and there's another guy who signed on it that leads the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a guy named Zawahiri. There's 2 or 3 others that sign on it, but basically issues 4 reasons for why it's every individual Muslim's responsibility to attack the West. The 4 reasons in general are: 1, we need to establish a global caliphate ruled by Sharia law. The second one is we're going to do this in response to infidels, Westerners, occupying Muslim holy lands. This goes back to the U.S. being in Saudi Arabia. The third one is we need to attack the United States, the far enemy, because they prop up the regional apostates, the near enemy, these regimes that oppress us. And the fourth one is American support to Israel. Those 4 reasons are why we need to attack the West. It is not long after, in 1998, I believe it was August 1998, there are dual bombings in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, okay, the 2 embassy bombings. This really puts Al-Qaeda on the map. So they declare war again in February 98. We have 2 big bombings. Then in 2000, October 2000, the USS Cole is attacked from Yemen, okay? They're doing a refueling operation just off the coast of Yemen. The Cole is attacked. And our response to each of these is what? In 98, we fired some cruise missiles. No one's quite sure what was hit. One of them was like a pharmaceutical factory, and we hit a tannery. We hit just some random targets, and we're like, okay, you take that, and then boom, nothing happened, all right? October 2000, same thing, right? Nothing really happens. So what I call this is the build-up to 9/11. Hey, we'll do an attack here. Nothing really happens. We do another attack, a little bit quicker. Nothing really happens. 9/11/2001, we all know what happens on 9/11/2001. So during this time, bin Laden moves in 96 from Sudan back to Afghanistan. He has recreated his safe haven, and now he has training camps. He's training operatives, building up cells globally. Also around 1998, he takes on a guy named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is sort of the mastermind operational planner who comes into their fold as well. He's the one who plans the 9/11 attacks on behalf of Al-Qaeda. He's also the cousin or uncle, I forget the relationship, of Ramzi Youssef, who had done the first World Trade Center attack. And essentially, you have all the parts together. And they've built up a cadre of, several thousand fighters that they have trained and indoctrinated in Afghanistan. So when 9/11 hits, you have you have 19 hijackers, most of them being centered around the Hamburg cell in Germany, who orchestrate this attack and put it together and hit the United States. The success is greater than they expected, really. And at the same point, that leads us to what I'll call 2.0, the second generation, okay? The post-9/11 Al-Qaeda. From 01 to 02, they're essentially on the run, starting the end of September all the way up to about February, March 2002. And there's a thing called Operation Anaconda in February 2002. The U.S. was this close at Tora Bora to getting bin Laden. This will be one of those counterfactual history things we can always study later. What if we had gotten bin Laden before he had slipped across the border into Pakistan? So this is February 2002. As this happens, he pushes into Pakistan, and on the intel front, the U.S. is chasing down a lot of operatives throughout Pakistan. Some of them, Obaida, some famous guys, picked up in Pakistan and arrested. And so it looks really rough for al-Qaeda here at this time. But the Taliban in Pakistan takes them in and provides them refuge. In 2003, we enter into Iraq, and this creates a resurgence, a breath of sort of air back into al-Qaeda. Because now, although they weren't in Iraq in significant numbers, now they have a great opportunity. And it starts what I call the second foreign fighter glut. Foreign fighters from around the Middle East and North Africa converge on Iraq. And they begin supplying pipelines, and they become a menace in Iraq. From 2003, you start to see the buildup. It hits its peak about 2006 and 7, before special operations, especially U.S. special operations, really decimate al-Qaeda in Iraq. A key person in this is a guy named Zarqawi. You'll see I put him down below with an X over his face. He's killed, I believe, in 2006. But during his time in Iraq, he really rejuvenates the foreign fighter flow. He gets people excited. He's doing, very spectacular attacks, but he also puts in an added dimension. He's hitting a lot of Shiite targets, and a lot of sectarian rifts are starting to unfold. At the same point, you see al-Qaeda executing attacks. You'll see the little yellow plots that are around there. The cells that they had already developed, the connections they already had as of 9/11, they become very active. So, down here in Kenya, you have the 2002 attacks on the Paradise Hotel. They fire a missile, an Israeli charter jet miss. You have Morocco, 2003, Tunisia, 2002, two very famous attacks. In 2004, you have the Madrid bombing of the train station. 2005, you have the subway bombings in London. The other places that you do see some spikes are the Bali bombing in 2002, a really spectacular attack that's often overlooked. Okay, Jakarta, you have some attacks. But then there's kind of a lull in these spectacular attacks. Everything sort of gravitates towards Iraq. And really what ends up happening is you have three types of al-Qaeda during al-Qaeda 2.0. First, you have the core. These are the guys, the original guys that were in Afghanistan. They move into Pakistan. They're still operating. They're still putting out guidance. They're issuing attacks, and they're trying to coordinate. One of the things they're trying to coordinate is with al-Qaeda in Iraq. There's a famous letter that's intercepted between Zawahiri and Zarqawi saying, hey, you need to tamp down and stop all these attacks on Shias because Muslim-on-Muslim violence sort of undermines what we're trying to do. At the same point, you start to see affiliates come into the fold. You have affiliates cropping up in other places that are starting to gain resonance and significance. Al-Qaeda in Iraq being the largest one. Another one is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which really started out as an Al-Qaeda movement in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia really clamps down on that group. So around the 05 to 07 period, you start to see that group in Saudi Arabia, which had been doing local attacks, sort of get squashed out. And by 2009, they have reunited with other al-Qaeda operatives in Yemen to form al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We're going to talk about this here coming forward, and it becomes a major issue. The other one you see is other terrorist groups and affiliates, namely those in North Africa, start to want to rebrand themselves as al-Qaeda. The most notable one, the first one taken on this one, was what was known as the GSPC in Algeria. You'll see it all the way out there to the left. In 2007, changed their name to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So they wanted to take on that brand because it was drawing a lot of recruits and popularity. They also figured, hey, if I join up with Al-Qaeda, maybe I can secure some resources from that organization as well. A third one that you see is known as Al-Shabaab, which you've heard in the news a lot lately. Al-Shabaab forms out of the Islamic Courts Union in about 2007, and they seem to have connections with Al-Qaeda, but it's a little bit unclear. It's not till many years later that they formally align with Al-Qaeda in 2012. So you have these attacks that are going on everywhere. You have affiliates that are based in several different regions. And the third part is what we call Al-Qaeda inspired. And this is what we hear about in the news here at home. So in the United States, what do we have? We have people getting on the internet, learning about Al-Qaeda, deciding to join Al-Qaeda, and then in times even doing attacks here in the States, right? Every, 2 to 4 months, you'll hear about some guy who seems like he's a little bit crazy, says he's part of Al-Qaeda, and he tried to put together a bomb, and it was FBI agents with him. It was a fake bomb, right? And he's arrested. So we have a lot of these going on. We also have some serious ones. We have a few foreign fighters, or Americans that go overseas, train in Afghanistan, and come back. The most notable being a guy named Zazi, who was going to try and bomb the New York subway system, okay? So we have these inspired types, these AQ-inspired attacks that aren't exactly directed. Sometimes they provide a little bit of guidance. Sometimes it's totally on their own. And we see people getting online and trying to communicate with a guy named Anwar Awlaki. You'll see down in the left-hand corner. As part of the Inspire movement, as Al-Qaeda is having a tough time building attacks in the United States, their message changes, and one of their strategies becomes, don't come to us, stay where you're at. You can help out Jihad and Al-Qaeda by doing an attack at home. They begin issuing propaganda that essentially says, here are ways where you can conduct attack where you're at. Inspire magazine from AQAP in Yemen is one of these key sort of facilitation magazines. And tons of websites that are out there, forums. And you see internet usage switch from just looking at propaganda to actually engaging, two-way engagement with Al-Qaeda leaders. Okay? And this breathes another little bit of life into Al-Qaeda. So you see these attacks going on in the U.S. We had an attempt right on Christmas Day in Detroit, 2009, I believe it was. We saw AQAP in Yemen try and put bombs in printer cartridges and UPS, body cavities, those sorts of things to try and attack us here in the States. A lot of that comes through the Inspire movement. Who can we drive and inspire? During all of this time, you see the attacks. A lot of them happen that are AQ core attacks right after 9/11, 2002 and 2003, and then the pace continues to go down. As Iraq hits its peak, 2006-07, you see a lot of foreign fighters going there, the surge. A lot of our special operations start to, dwindle them down. And you see a slight movement over to Pakistan. And you see them move back, and what the engagement essentially becomes is around 2007 to 11. You have a lot of foreign fighters migrating there. Another group they join is the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. IMU is another group that's there. You see a lot of Germans for some reason, German foreign fighters that join up with this group. They're conducting attacks and working with the Taliban. So this is that next sort of phase. This is what I call 2.0. And in the way I'm breaking it here, I'm breaking it very definitively. A lot of this blends and overlaps together. But this is that second generation. Bin Laden's still there. Zawahiri's still there. They're holed up in Pakistan, but the control is starting to slip away. They're conducting fewer attacks, and the U.S. begins to do drone operations in Pakistan. And it devastates Al-Qaeda's leadership. 1, 2, 3, 10, 15 major leaders. And then in May 2011, we do the raid to eliminate bin Laden. And things very much change for Al-Qaeda, and they very much change for us as well. So that's sort of where I'm breaking what I call Al-Qaeda 2.0. This is the three sort of layers. It changes on that day. And then we move to what I'll call Al-Qaeda 3.0, which is really a push towards affiliates. So if you look at the time since bin Laden died, we continue to pursue drones, leadership decapitation. Awlaki's killed shortly after. Harun Fazul, part of the embassy attacks on one of Al-Qaeda's operatives in Somalia, he's killed. You see several leaders in Yemen killed. The one we see is this period of what I call ups and downs. And you guys see it on CNN. It's very confusing if you try and understand terrorism through CNN, because the worst threat ever comes every 90 days, and it's in a different place probably you've never heard of, right? So the first blip after bin Laden's death really comes at the same time that AQAP in Yemen is on the rise. You have some former Guantanamo detainees that link up there. You have consolidation between some in Saudi and some in Yemen, and AQAP in Yemen becomes a huge deal about 2011. Awlaki is there, he's killed, but they start to pursue a different strategy after bin Laden's death, where they start to integrate with locals and create a group called Ansar al-Sharia. This name comes up quite a bit now. Ansar al-Sharia was like a grassroots movement. We're going to actually make a caliphate here in Yemen and try and govern. And they did. They control large portions of Yemen. So by 2012, spring of 2012, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, is seen as the greatest threat from terrorism. We, as counterterrorists, put a lot of emphasis into it. There's a lot of drone strikes. The Yemeni government, we back them, and you see a dip. They start to lose ground, and there's still battles going on to today. I mean, this is still a major battleground, but the threat is seen to be somewhat diminished, although the fight's still there. Right after that, you start to see, in early 2012, AQIM branch out and take over basically all of northern Mali. They do the same thing. They use a similar model. We're going to work with grassroots groups, MUJWA, some other ones that are there, Ansar Deen. We're going to work with them. We're going to integrate with them. And then we're going to build a caliphate in the middle of the desert. And they do. And they control it for quite some time. Until the French intervene. The French intervene, boom, you see a big dip. The CNN articles are way too late, right? They say, oh, AQIM is the next big threat to America. You need to worry about this. They're in Mali. And then you have the In Amenas gas facility attack. Maybe you're familiar with this. I think it was in January 2013. A guy named Balmukhtar, earlier this year, conducts a big attack on a gas facility, kills a lot of Westerners. But AQIM is seen as this giant threat, and then boop, blip goes down. They move throughout North Africa. I'm going to move now to Somalia. After bin Laden's death, Shabab officially becomes part, in early 2012, of Al-Qaeda. They officially align with Al-Qaeda. And when this happens, the next thing you hear is, this is the next big threat of Al-Qaeda we need to worry about. And it was somewhat true, because we had lots of Westerners. We had about 20 to 40 Americans in Minneapolis travel and join Shabab in Somalia. We had a guy named Omar Hamami, who was a famous kid from southern Alabama, most notably known on television because he has raps. He sings rap videos, so we think that's neat, and we pay attention to it. He goes and joins, and he's been there since about 2007. So there's some nervousness about it. Shabab collapses of its own demise, begins fighting itself. However, they still retain some capability, and just last month we see they do an attack in Nairobi, Kenya. So even amongst their dysfunction, they still display that they can do an attack in Kenya. Another one I want to move to, Ansar al-Sharia. There's another group that props up right after Libya falls called Ansar al-Sharia, based in and around Darna, Libya, and a town known as Benghazi. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Benghazi. The Benghazi attack happens on 9/11 of 2012. Did I get my dates right? Yeah, of 2012. Still uncertain what it is, but it's come out in recent days that there was an Al-Qaeda connection. There seems to be an Al-Qaeda planning, and operatives have integrated with a local group in Libya. So you have attacks there. And the latest one that's really come onto the forefront, and especially is significant now with the problems in Egypt, is you've had a group called Al-Qaeda in the Sinai, essentially. They've begun trying to control parts of Sinai. You see a lot of arrest in Cairo. And while they had sort of sputtered there for a while, life has sort of come back into them with the fall of Morsi. Because from Al-Qaeda's perspective, and Zawahiri, who is an Egyptian, we told you democracy wouldn't work. We told you if you pursue democracy, it'll fail. The only other alternative now is violence. So this is an appealing narrative, in that region. Most importantly, and this is kind of where I'll stop before I move on to the future, is Syria. Of all the Arab Spring conflicts, where we've seen up and down, Syria has raged on now for 2+ years. And the longer it goes on, they attract more and more and more foreign fighters. Thousands. And this is really the third giant wave of foreign fighters that we've seen. First one was Afghanistan. Second one was Iraq and Afghanistan during the 2000s. And now Syria is drawing probably somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 foreign fighters, if I had to put a number on it. They're all descending on Syria, but what's been interesting about it is Al-Qaeda and their ability or inability to control this foreign fighter flood that's going in there. Of all the conflicts that have erupted after bin Laden's death, the U.S. has gone in and done something except in Syria. When we had a threat in Yemen, we went in there, boom. When there was a threat in AQIM in the Sahel, the French invaded. When we had Benghazi, Libya, we at least put some sort of emphasis on there. Shabab in Somalia, we've been working with counterterrorism partners to deal with it. In Syria, we have nothing. We've been delaying and delaying and delaying. And the longer it goes on, the more it grows. And the more it grows, that becomes the third wave down the road. So what's fascinating, though, about this third sort of generation of al-Qaeda is there are two strains of al-Qaeda type things going on in Syria right now. The first one that I want to talk about is called Jabhat al-Nusra, or al-Nusra or Nusra, you'll hear it called that, or JN. They attracted tons of foreign fighters. They really became the face of al-Qaeda. The belief was underneath the surface. There's a lot of coordination between al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan or AQAP in Yemen, and that there's coordination going on there, and they would be the next forefront, the next wave of al-Qaeda that you need to worry about. However, earlier this year, the Islamic State of Iraq, also known as al-Qaeda in Iraq, starts to enter into eastern Syria. And when they do, they on their own initiative, this is about May timeframe, announce the merger of Nusra and al-Qaeda in Iraq. But maybe this wasn't coordinated with Zawahiri and the senior leadership. And so there's a back and forth that goes on through the spring about whether they're one group or whether they're two groups. And Zawahiri comes out later and says, nope, what is Nusra, what is Islamic State of Iraq is Islamic State of Iraq. A guy named al-Baghdadi who runs Islamic State of Iraq says, we don't really agree with that. We're going to merge. And so to this day, going on right now, you see this weird occurrence where you see al-Qaeda affiliates at times coordinating with each other and at times fighting each other. And just this past month, you see Zawahiri, the leader in Pakistan, put out an open call. He literally posted in English on the internet and in Arabic and says, hey, we all need to stop fighting each other and just focus on the far enemy, right? We need to focus on the far enemy. Don't worry about that. And whenever you get into spats with people locally, just put that aside for now. All of us need to get rid of Assad and the regime, and then later we're going to come back and we'll take care of those guys. It is out of control right now, essentially, in Syria. This is the only thing that's really saving us from having this huge wave of al-Qaeda that can come back and haunt us, is that there's internal bickering going on. And so what we're looking at with al-Qaeda in this third wave, third version of al-Qaeda, 2011 is present, is we have all sorts of affiliates, but are they going to listen to al-Qaeda Central? That's really what the question is. Is this one unified thing, or is this lots of different groups who are al-Qaeda-like, but are kind of going to do their own thing moving forward? So for FPRI, actually, just a couple months ago, I was trying to just do an assessment. This is just my assessment, by the way, so you can ignore it. I may be totally wrong. To look at who are the old guard al-Qaeda members that may still be loyal, and who are the sort of new upstarts that kind of think they can go do their own thing. So the lines you see in red are what I estimated to be the communication, essentially, between the different groups. Al-Qaeda Central up in the top right-hand corner, if you believe and everything is controlled by Al-Qaeda Central, that's where I sort of think the communications are. In the midst of this, Al-Qaeda has designated a new number 2, who is the leader of AQAP in Yemen, a guy named Wuhashi, if I said it right, Wuhashi. In Yemen, he essentially has given authority to him to be the number 2. And in doing so, in my opinion, has said, the new Al-Qaeda Central is in Yemen. I'm here alone. I probably won't ever make it out of Pakistan. I can control some operations, but as we just saw with the drone attack on the Taliban here just 2 days ago, where he killed Masood, I'm having a tough time. So if I want to keep control of this organization, I need to hand it off, and I'm going to hand it off to Yemen. And there's evidence that this happened. There's been documents show up in Cairo which show that AQAP in Yemen has been distributed money. There were AQAP operatives that are supposedly being sought in connection with Benghazi. The other thing that you see is AQIM's documents, whenever they're on the retreat from the French, they get left at a lot of different buildings. Actually, the Associated Press has published a bunch of great studies of this. And they say, hey, we've been trying to reach out to Al-Qaeda Central, and sometimes they answer back, but a lot of times we don't hear back from them. So we send them messages trying to tell them what we're doing or ask for guidance, and we don't hear from anybody. So the communication is very uneven. At the same point, with each of these affiliates, what you see is them building their own affiliates regionally. Shabab has built their own affiliates in Kenya. AQIM has created a lot of connections with a group named Boko Haram in Nigeria. AQIM also has connections in Libya. And at the same point, in Syria, you see foreign fighters from Libya and a lot of these different locations traveling to Syria. There's all sorts of connections there, but in terms of alliances and allegiances, it's not very clear what's going to happen. So, going forward, looking into the future, what should we think? One, in the news, only two things are responsible for violence. One, Al-Qaeda, or two, lone wolves. That's every story is put in those two contexts. Who did it? Al-Qaeda. And then if you asked a CNN reporter, well, what's Al-Qaeda? They go, bin Laden and stuff. It's real vague, okay? There's lots of Al-Qaeda-like things out there now, but some of them are pursuing their own agendas. And so for us strategically in the U.S., we have to sort of look at it and say, is this exactly what was 9/11? Or are they pursuing their own agendas? Or are there other things that we should consider? The next thing is, can we keep affiliates competing rather than coordinating? You have leaders of Al-Qaeda now. Let's say they joined in Iraq in 2004 and 5, or went to Afghanistan in 2004 and 5 as foreign fighters. They've been doing this for 10 years. They've never seen their bosses. So they don't know who Zawahiri is. What kept Al-Qaeda 2.0 going was all these folks had fought together. The leader in AQAP, he was with the original Al-Qaeda members. AQIM, Belmokhtar, he was with the original Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan. Today, I don't know those guys. I read their pronouncements. They inspired me 10 years ago, but am I loyal to them forever? And I try and give an analogy when I talk in the States. I'm like, what's it like if you don't see your boss for 2 years? Do you get his emails? And what do you answer back? You go, I'm on it. Yep. Boop. Send, right? How loyal are people moving forward is what we really need to assess. Okay? Is this a grand conspiracy, or are people seeking out their own path? So when we're looking at these affiliates, can we keep them competing, or will they ultimately coordinate? There are certain actions that we could do, the U.S., this is in my opinion. Let's say we send an occupation force into Syria. Would that help compete or coordinate? I would tell you it would help coordinate. Suddenly everything, okay, all our disputes, boom, we're going to focus on this. So strategically, we got to be a lot more nimble than we were even 10 years ago. Next thing is, can we help focus on restraining resources? This is completely overlooked in a lot of discussions. What did bin Laden do? 1, he put out a vision. 2, he had strategic goals. But 3, he had money. He had his own money. These guys don't that are left. They have to build their own fortunes. You have a lot more freedom to be a visionary, to put resources behind things, to move in your own direction when you have your own money. He jump-started Al-Qaeda in the beginning. When you look at the documents picked up in Abbottabad during that raid, a lot of them are requests for money. It doesn't look like that on the surface. Like, we think your ideas are all great, and then at the end they're like, so we've been thinking about maybe we could use some money. That's like kind of how it closes. If you have kids that go to college, it's a lot like those. And I could use $20 because I got something moving forward. They're trying to figure out how to get resources. It's one of the main draws to join Al-Qaeda. If Al-Qaeda isn't distributing resources to you, the draw goes down. Okay? So focusing on restraining resources will be important for us. The other one is, will affiliates gravitate to an emerging leader? We struggle right now on our television news because when these drone strikes happen, reporters generally don't know who these people are, unless it's one of the very, very top people. They'll say, some guy was hit with a drone somewhere. That's the news report you get. And you go, okay. Those leaders are important, and they do have following, but they're operational leaders. And what you haven't seen, at least not yet, I think it will happen, is another big Al-Qaeda leader that will emerge who can inspire people. A lot of them have tried, but there's only been a handful. Al-Awlaki was starting to get people going. he was inspiring enough people that even the leaders of AQAP in Yemen said, I will step out of the way to let this guy be the leader because he is drawing in recruits. He is inspiring the movement. Who's going to be that in Syria? I don't know because there's competition right now. But there are a couple people there, and that's something we really need to watch for. If there's going to be another al-Qaeda moving forward, if you're going to have a globally distributed organization, you have to have some sort of inspirational figure that is pushing this forward. Bin Laden did that. Zawahiri is not having the same effect. Al-Awlaki was sort of doing that. Who's going to do that moving forward if they're going to stay alive? It'll be important to look at. In my opinion, AQ's future will be determined by what the outcome is in Syria and what really should be said is Iraq. We have a border that we've thrown in there, but from al-Qaeda's perspective right now, Anbar province, western Iraq, eastern Syria, it's all one place. And what happens there, how that is handled, will essentially determine what I think al-Qaeda will be moving forward. I think there's a strong possibility that what you see in these attacks, like in Kenya and other places, if they are connected to AQ Central, is trying to drum up support for AQ Central because they don't really have their hands in Syria the way they would like to be controlling it. They're being ignored in a lot of ways. So looking forward, one of the things that I really think everybody should be looking to is what comes out of Syria and Iraq. That's where the center of gravity is going to be on the horizon, mostly because we here in the U.S. haven't done anything about it. In every other location, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Libya, Egypt, we've gotten involved. In everyone in Syria, we've kind of taken our hands off. And if you're a foreign fighter recruit, you're very fickle. You want to play for a winner. So I was doing this in a briefing about 10 days ago. You can watch in social media as things go up and down. In Mali, when the French first invasion, you'd see calls, everybody go to Mali. We're going to fight against the French. And that lasted like 2 days. And then it was like, Syria, everybody go to Syria. And Syria is like stayed, drumming up support. Whenever they do find resistance, whenever things do go sour, the surge in Iraq, you do see foreign fighters start to tail off. They have not tailed off for Syria at all. They continue to grow. With that, a strong caveat, we don't know that everybody who goes to fight in Syria is also going to want to later attack the U.S. That's not necessarily the case. So there's some opportunities there for us to navigate back and forth. The other thing I wanted to close with, well, there's 2 or 3 points, and then I want to talk about how you can watch this if you want. When you go back to what I call the 4 big beefs of al-Qaeda back in the 90s, what they put down. 1, we want to establish a global caliphate. They've tried to do this several times now. They tried doing it in Yemen, they tried doing it in Mali, and what happens? It doesn't go real well, okay? Governance is hard. We see that here in the States, right? So when they get involved with governance and things don't go real well, kind of undermines that objective, like building this global caliphate. And their violence almost always gets out of hand and undermines their ability to govern. The problem with al-Qaeda is they bring in young guys who want to kill people, and then once you tell them, hey, let's govern, they go, but when do I get to kill people? Right? Young people don't join so they can run the sanitation department in Anbar province, Iraq. Young people join so they can go kill people. That's part of the motivation behind this ideology for young people. Okay? How do they control and restrain that? There's a great book out right now called The Terrorist Dilemma, which is from a guy named Jake Shapiro, who I co-wrote with on al-Qaeda's misadventures in the Horn of Africa. He talks about this. The big problem for a lot of these terrorist groups is if you actually start to move forward on your objectives, how you contain the violence of all these guys that you brought in. Great example of this, Zawahiri in his latest document says, one of the things you should do to fight jihad is not buy American goods. I'm 21, I traveled halfway around the world, and you're telling me the best way to get at the U.S. is to not buy an iPhone. No. When am I going to get to kill people? That's why they do this. You don't see a video on YouTube that's an al-Qaeda video that shows someone not buying an iPhone. You see a beheading video. You see an attack in Iraq. This is a huge problem for this organization because if they are ever going to move towards that objective of governing, they have to figure out how to control all these young people. And they're not always in it for the ideology. Some of them are. A lot of them are in it because they want to hang out with a group of buddies. A lot of them are in it because they want to go find adventure. A A lot of them have nothing else to go on. Which brings me to what I call the Al-Qaeda is growing theory. So in a lot of articles you'll see, if you start from 9/11 to now, every year you would see that Al-Qaeda is larger if you just read the news, right? They're bigger, they're growing, it's going to get bigger. There was a little period there we started talking about them being strategically defeated, but we picked that back up now, and everything's about how they're getting stronger, they're getting stronger, getting stronger. Al-Qaeda goes where their ideology can recruit people. It's not a coincidence that they moved to Africa. So while they've had residents at times in the Middle East, they've moved to locations where their ideology is going to resonate. Where does it resonate? Places where there's poor governance, places where that ideology can easily be resourced and not competed with against other things. Where does this happen? Mali. Libya, we have a huge governance vacuum now. Egypt, we're starting to see the collapse of the state, another opportunity. Northern Nigeria, where there's been a long, enduring ethnic conflict between Muslims and Christians, okay? The ideology will move where it can get gravity and where it can gain recruits. So when you see the maps, if I put up this map, this is pretty routine. You'll see someone arguing on television, they'll say, see, Al-Qaeda is stronger than ever because they're in more places now than they were before. But sometimes it's one or two guys, and sometimes it's 10, and sometimes it's thousands. Being dispersed doesn't always mean strength. I am more worried about Syria because there's a lot of people, and it's concentrated. They have no resistance. They can build a headquarters. They can operate. They can resource themselves. So you can get rid of all those dots and just focus on Syria. That's why I'm more concerned. So when you think about it moving forward, the ideology will migrate where it has opportunity. The question is, will we do anything to squelch that opportunity for them? Last thing I wanted to talk about was headquarters. Bin Laden, Zawahiri, when they were in Pakistan, they provided a headquarters. They gave out guidance. They kind of tried to keep everything in line. That ability has gone down, and it really has shifted to Yemen. They've designated, essentially, Yemen as the new Al-Qaeda Central, AQAP. Will there be two headquarters, though? They don't really have their tentacles in Syria probably the way they want. And so if you have two headquarters, it really divides things up. So something to look for in the future is if there are Al-Qaeda attacks, especially outside against Western targets, are they coming from Yemen or are they coming from Syria and groups that are there? That's something probably a year or two down the road. The last thing is a lot of these guys are on their own. They're building their own resource stream. And what you see Bin Laden used to do, which was get donors, backers, funnel that money to opportunities with Al-Qaeda affiliates. Now you've got Al-Qaeda affiliates doing their own Kickstarter crowdfunding campaigns on Twitter. If you want, you can send money to a group in Syria today. All you have to do is get on social media. And this has created this weird phenomenon. Al-Qaeda endorsed and really pushed for the internet as a way to get their message out to a lot of different people. But now today, they can't control it. Just like you can't control your children who are on social media, right? So you look at what's going on in Al-Qaeda. Essentially, it's created this weird function where now every 18-year-old can also join up with Al-Qaeda. And some of them understand the objectives, and some of them don't, okay? And so what resonates with them may not always resonate with everybody. And you see this weird thing going on. So ideology is becoming more diffuse, funding is becoming more diffuse, and you see every group competing for their own recruits and every group competing for their own resources. One group, it's going to be basically around leaders and how they can draw audience, how they can propel their own movement, how they can fund themselves. This is the on-your-own era of terrorism. So they're all going to find their own way to do this moving forward. I'll leave on this one, and I'll take questions.
Thanks. A great presentation. Great presentation, Clint. Really loved it. I've got one question for you and an observation for the teachers. I'll start with the observation, actually. Just thinking about the two presentations this morning, I was thinking about the challenge last night of how to present these very, very complex problems to high school students. And I was thinking that one useful thing might be taking these two different presentations and asking the students to sit in the seat of President Obama right now and put the Syria problem in front of him, because he's got two different strategic threats in Syria, because Assad is aligned with Iran. And many people, myself included, would say Iran is the #1 strategic threat to the United States. At the same time, he's got this growing al-Qaeda thing there, and our strategic enemy, Iran, is fighting al-Qaeda, our other strategic enemy, in Syria. And on top of that, our strategic enemy, al-Qaeda, is split between two different groups in Syria. So just putting that problem in front of the students and saying, what should President Obama do about this strategic problem? I think already puts you in a realization that this thing is not simple at all. There's just no easy way out of it. So Clint, my question for you is, could you just in a couple of sentences describe what you see to be the U.S. strategy about this all right now, and what are the things that keep you up at night? Where do you think, do you evaluate our strategy? Do you think it's good, or are there areas where you think we're really blind or really need to be a little bit stronger?
Yep.
Thanks.
So I'm thrilled he asked that question. So in counterterrorism, actually, I don't know, I think I wrote it in conjunction with FPR. I was like, counterterrorism and hot dogs don't tell us how it's made. That's the American viewpoint on where we're at. After 9/11, no one cared how many phone calls were being monitored. No one cared where people were detained. No one cared how we got them. Okay? So I was an FBI agent in 2002. No one even thought about these things. It was go, 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 go. Okay? There are several components to our counterterrorism strategy. Many of them have been taken off the table in just the past 2 or 3 years. I'm going to talk about a few of them, by and large. Actually, I'll talk about what was happening essentially around 2005. The first one was, what are we going to do? We're going to democratize the Middle East, and we're going to build up all of these countries so that they're stable, and we'll essentially take the lifeline of terrorism out. Why would anyone want to be a terrorist if you have a democratic government and you have opportunity at home? This turned out to be extremely expensive and very difficult to execute. And so we have pulled out of the occupation sort of strategy, okay? I was never part of that. That was really assigned to the military and the State Department in a way. I wasn't really a part of that. But what I was part of was pursuing terrorists, or the counterterrorism strategy. And that essentially has evolved to one thing now, which is drones. We got really, really good at drones. And why? Let's look at why we got to drones. Why did we come to drones? Right after 9/11, one of the first things we did was what? We detained people, right? We either brought them to Guantanamo Bay or we brought them to black sites. The first thing to fall or really get people up in arms was black sites, right? And we took that off the table, probably a good thing. The other thing that we've been trying to sort of get rid of, but we're not sure how, because we didn't think through it right after 9/11, was Guantanamo Bay. What do we do with it? If we let prisoners go, what happens? Some of them become the leaders of AQAP, which is now AQ Central, right? Some of them recede. That's the problem with all prison programs, whether it's criminal or terrorist. And we have no way to really try them, because how did we do evidence discovery after 9/11? Blindfold, handcuffs, bag of stuff, airplane, whoo, go. Guy wakes up on a beach in Cuba, all right? Like, that was how we were doing it. We weren't thinking about these things, about how we're going to set up a legal structure around it. So we then thought, okay, maybe we'll try people in the United States. And what happened with that? No one like that. Oof, I'm going to try people in the U.S. So we have no detention policy at this point, none whatsoever, okay? So you take detention off the table. I forgot a fourth part. The fourth part was we have our partners keep people for us. What happens when we have our partners keep people for us? One, they undermine our values because they torture people. They do all sorts of, aggressive interrogation techniques. Or two, Al-Qaeda springs them loose. There's a prison break. You could do a 10-hour documentary on prison breaks by Al-Qaeda. The leader of AQAP broke out of a prison in Yemen. He was caught and captured. So we have a multi-part detention policy that has completely either failed or been removed. So we have no options. So what does that leave us with? One, we can back proxies. We did this a lot, right? We did this in Pakistan, we've done it in Yemen, we've done it in a lot of other places, and it creates perverse incentives from a counterterrorist point of view. I want to get 99% of Al-Qaeda guys in my country, but it would be good to keep 1 or 2 because I would like that funding to continue to come to my country. If you pay me $100 every year, and I still got 2 or 3 guys out there, I'll get $100 next year too. Okay, so we create some perverse incentives when we go through proxies. The other thing that happens is we can't always control the proxies. We essentially start to sacrifice control. So we create a militia maybe in Pakistan that will help us out in our objectives, but they go through and do what? They're extremely heavy-handed. They commit human rights violations. When they do this, what happens? You guys are the ones that the Americans, put these evildoers onto us. And so we still want to commit terrorism against you. So we get this weird problem. This brings us to drones. Why did we move to drones? One, they were highly effective. When we started eliminating Al-Qaeda's leadership, what happened? We started to really see things break down in Pakistan. 2, we have no detention policy. So if you can't detain somebody, this isn't like how it was thought up, but this sort of naturally happens over time. If you can't detain people, the next best thing is to eliminate them, right? 3, we don't have to deal with proxies. We do a little bit. We have to work through intelligence and everything else, but what can we do? We can observe, we can engage, we can do that all by jumping over those proxy arrangements. And our proxies, they do support us and help us with that, but it gives us a big edge. We can see and control what's going on. Drones over the past 2 years in the public, not been the biggest thing. Us Americans, we're getting weird. We're finding out that occasionally we kill people that are innocent, right? So when we look at our options, moving forward in terms of counterterrorism, and I don't want to forget this one. What's the next layer of that? Surveillance, right? That's what's in the news today. Surveillance is, you can't interdict with drones if you don't have a good surveillance program. You can't interdict terrorists even with law enforcement measures if you don't have a good surveillance program. We were supposed to share information to prevent the next 9/11. We shared so much information that the whole world has it now, right? About every one of our allies and everything they ever did for us. They are not too happy with us, okay? So we're at a problem in America. And it comes probably from a couple different things. One, we haven't really communicated the threat very well. But it's also such an amorphous threat, as you probably saw from my presentation. I work on this all the time, and I can't even understand what's going to go on. So we have to come to some sort of, moment of zen with ourselves about how we want to do counterterrorism, how much we want to sacrifice. You wouldn't even have this discussion 10 years ago. If I had said, we're going to do counterterrorism on 9/12/2001, but here's what we're going to do. We're not going to work with partners. We're not going to detain anybody. We're not going to hit anybody with drones. We're not going to do any surveillance. Everybody would have laughed, right? 10 years changes a lot. And so the American public has to decide what they want, what they want to trade off in order to get certain things. So there's been a call for a lot of transparency. This has been tough, for them to really get their hands around. I don't know when it will happen. We tend to just go in ups and downs, right? After 9/11, how did you let this happen? Do whatever you can. Don't let this happen again 10 years later. How did you do that? I can't believe you did that. Okay. It'll take another attack before we'll probably go back the other way. We won't have the discussion. This is just the nature of our government right now. Social Security, debt ceiling, it doesn't matter what it is. We don't have the discussion. We just wait till crisis, then we react the other way. In terms of Syria and Al-Qaeda, I don't stay up at night that much, to be honest. There are certain things that we have done really, really well. One, leadership decapitation, I think, is critical. The other thing is intelligence and surveillance, I think, is extremely important. We've been able to do this, and that keeps us from doing a third thing, which we did do, which we don't want to do anymore, which is military intervention, extended military intervention in a foreign country. That's what really draws a giant magnet to us from these terrorist groups. So we don't want to do that moving forward. So in terms of Al-Qaeda in Syria, my biggest concern with them is of the 4 initial objectives of Al-Qaeda when they set out: build a global caliphate, remove the U.S. from Holy Lands, defeat the far enemy because they're propping up the near enemy, U.S. support for Israel. Let's look at them. Everyone knows that as an Al-Qaeda supporter, they're probably not going to really build a global caliphate. I don't think people at the 18 to 25-year-old level are joining for that anyways. The other one, the U.S. doesn't occupy Holy Lands. We've actually taken a lot of our military capability out of Saudi Arabia, places like this. I don't think that's a strong justification anymore. The U.S. props up local regimes. How can you say that post-Arab Spring? We helped topple Gaddafi. Egypt, we let it go. And we're in a weird spot now, but I mean, we sort of let that go. We've still sort of backed certain ones in Yemen and other places, but that can't be a strong argument to join. Which brings me to number 4, and this is what remains and what is probably the scary sort of thing. All al-Qaeda groups unify in Syria, and they all turn themselves towards Israel. That, I think, is the big strategic dilemma on the al-Qaeda side, not the Iranian side. Or, even worse, those two strategic interests, the Iranian threat and the al-Qaeda threat, both sort of say, okay, we're just going to keep our areas where we're at now, but you know what we want to do that's in common, we want to focus towards Israel. That's the fourth one that I think can really unify a lot of people. So I hope I answered that question correctly in about a 15-minute discussion. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yes, my question revolves around the Boston bomber
Yep.
and his ties with the Chechenian aspect of Al-Qaeda.
Right.
Also, and with our strained relations with Russia, are there still strained relations within the law enforcement international community between the United States and Russia to work together to thwart these terroristic threats?
Okay. I'll start from the end of your question and move the other way. So one thing that I have noticed from my experience with law enforcement is they actually, regardless of like international or whatever, they tend to work together pretty well at the tactical level. So cops tend to work with cops fairly well. Like you might find like a local cop from Boston might work with a local cop in Russia better than they work with the FBI, just from my experience. You know, we hear that in New York, the NYPD, FBI rivalry, but in terms of law enforcement investigations, it's surprising how much cooperation there is at the investigation level. In terms of connections with the Boston bomber, the same thing is going on today on CNN, if you check the news. Why did he do it? It's probably what the title even is of the article. This guy in LA, right, the LAX shooter. Why did he do it? Americans are obsessed with finding a reason for why everybody does everything. The first thing I figured out when working with the FBI is the reasons oftentimes don't make sense. And so the Boston bombing, was there a connection? Was it this al-Qaeda thing? No. This would be in the inspired category. Was he inspired by al-Qaeda's rhetoric and ideology? Yes, but a lot of it had like a Chechen angle to it. And while there are Chechen al-Qaeda connections and all that, it's kind of loose. You know, it's not really definitive. The other thing you find when you look through the Boston bomber case is how just erratic and sporadic it was for that guy. He radicalized based on a lot of like local and family and psychological factors that he had. I actually lived in Boston up till about 3 or 4 months ago, about a mile from where the bomb went off. And my wife got her hair cut. I told this story before. Used to get her hair cut right down there, and he worked next door. She didn't know this till much later. But he used to get into fights with people at the place where she got her hair cut because they weren't covered or, you know, portraying these things. His ideology shifted over a 2 to 3 year period several different times. And so to say there's a definitive al-Qaeda angle, I don't. I see him more in the inspired category. And to put some perspective on that from law enforcement, what you saw there, I threw up that social media chart. The FBI, I would just guess in Boston, for every one of the Boston bombers, they probably had 200 other social media or communication type leads, just like the Boston bomber. And from an investigative perspective, you know, I've been out on a few of these. You show up and you go, hey, you said some really bad stuff on the internet about how you want to kill people. Do you want to kill people? And the guy goes, oh, no, I was just having a bad day. You get one chance really to interview that guy, and you have to make, you know, a sort of assessment. It seems like they did have a tip. You know, it sounds like I don't know the investigation that in depth. But this is the problem with a lot of these things. A lot of them are AQ-inspired kind of attacks. And that's really what you saw a surge of about 2007 from the law enforcement community. And how do you assess these things as being serious? There's a huge psychological component to it. The connections to al-Qaeda sometimes are very strong, like in the case of Zazi, who was the New York City guy who wanted to bomb the New York City subway system. But the Chechen connections, I think it was there. I think it was inspired from him, but I think he decided to take action, on his own, which is what Al-Qaeda is putting out. Which puts us in a weird place. Because you say, oh, this is an Al-Qaeda attack, and you're like, how do you know that? Did he talk to anybody in Al-Qaeda? No, but he was inspired by the ideology. Let's look at a sovereign citizen guy who decides to kill a cop. Was this a sovereign citizen attack? No, that guy was crazy. We change the context depending on the individual. Sorry.
Ami?
Thank you.
And then we'll
Thank you
go-
very much for your talk. It was actually very, very useful. And my question is very simple. You, and I agree with you that Syria is Syria, Iraq, and I agree that there's no border between them in that sense, is the most important part, and you emphasize Yemen, but you didn't emphasize what you call Al-Qaeda Central, Pakistan / maybe Afghanistan.
Right.
Post-2014, do you see that that could rejuvenate, especially if we don't have a BSA, that's an agreement between the U.S. and Afghanistan on how we would retain troops if we would, or there's very small footprint and the Afghans don't get their act together after the elections. Do you foresee a revival, perhaps not in Pakistan so much, but in the border areas more towards Afghanistan? Thank you.
As long as there's a Syria, no. However, I expect it to be very similar to what we saw when we left Iraq. So we left Iraq, just a little bit of bad stuff going on, and over time, with no pressure, they reestablished a safe haven. They began doing planning. The only thing that hurts the Pakistan-Afghanistan sort of angle is, unlike in Syria, they're not as close to targets of interest. So if you look back at the 9/11 attacks, they planned in Afghanistan. They had to go through a year and a half of elaborate planning and preparation to get to the 9/11 attacks. In Iraq right now, or Syria, they can execute attacks in Europe. They've already sort of shown linkages, I think even back to London, as recently as 3 or 4 weeks ago. Will it happen in Pakistan? I think so. You're going to see a resurgence in the sense because there's no pressure on them. When you take that pressure off, they'll resurge. But unless they can draw a lot of resources, unless they can draw a lot of recruits, and they can gain access to targets, then they're going to have a tougher time. So it may not occur in the presence of other things. Now, let's say Syria went down and Iraq went down. Something gets started, or they turn their sights on India, some sort of regional conflict, which it could potentially draw a lot of foreign fighters. Do I expect them to be somewhat resurgent? Yes, but I don't expect them to outtake what's going on in Syria right now.
Okay, Rebecca Eisenberg.
Hi, I have a clarifying question.
Yep.
Something that keeps cropping up is Kenya. And my question is why, and you've already addressed this a little bit, but why does Kenya keep cropping up in all of these attacks and headquarters and planning spots?
Okay. So as part of a project that I did, I ended up working on Kenya and Africa because nobody else wanted to. Everybody was focused on Iraq at the time. So I went to Kenya in 2007 when I was studying this. And Kenya comes up for some of the same reasons that like Pakistan will come up. It's a weaker state. And it has ethnic divisions and religious divisions which help fuel the insurgency that Al-Qaeda can grab onto. So Al-Qaeda, when they were in Somalia, which is a failed state, seems like a great opportunity, right? You go into a failed state, it's Wild West, you can do whatever. They kind of got chewed up. It was so chaotic they couldn't even get their own organization going. In Kenya, you have a weaker law enforcement environment and a state that functions but can't put pressure on terrorists the same way you might see here in the U.S. They have availability to Western targets. So Kenya is the hub for the Horn of Africa. It's sort of the strongest nation, both economically and politically, but it also has connections back to Britain, Great Britain being number one, the old colonial connections, and to the West. And they have economic targets, the port in Mombasa, Nairobi, tourism. So it is a nice target for them where they also have access and they can play on local support. So the Kenyan coast is Muslim. They're at a very tenuous relationship with the central government. And because they can play on that for support. So the whole coast doesn't support Al-Qaeda, but you can pick out ones and twos that are help facilitate throughout it. So Kenya is a soft target that they can continue to hit, which they have now 3 times, if you look at it. Shabab has done it now, but they're an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Those are the main three reasons.
And with that, we're going to have to bring this session to a close. Thank you. Join me in thanking Clint Watts,